Good morning. Hello out there. I think I figured it out. This is Dr. Gene Mesco coming to you from the Evolving Church of Science, speaking for all of us mostly hairless apes wandering about the planet. We're narrowing in on the American election with all of its madness. There's a different feel from 2020 and 2016. 2016 was such a bizarre experience. And yet, there was a belief that there was no way that the orange parasite could win. And then the way it played out, they have to give them a tip of the hat because they'd manipulated and focused their efforts on the Electoral College. And they pulled off just a staggering electoral victory with that archaic Electoral College system. And then enough Americans stepped up in 2020 to say enough of that nonsense. And I have to confess, I'm feeling confident that Kamala Harris is going to win this one. Just because I can't believe Americans could be stupid enough to put the orange parasite back in the Oval Office. Oh, there's plenty who do want to stir the pot, who are angry at the machine that's out there. Because the evolving civilization we're in has really come to be dominated by capitalism. And they play the religions card, the belief system cards, and they manipulate the marvelous fundamental Christians who've stopped thinking about things other than themselves and how their group needs to survive. But we really need to look at the planet. And that's what I'm trying to get to. And it hit me a while ago that I found a way to do it. I dropped an egg into the Bible. And I realized the egg comes first. It's the answer to the eternal chicken and the egg problem. And when you have an egg or a big zero and you drop it into the Bible, you get the Bioble. The Bioble is the Bible according to science, the biology Bible, the life Bible, which says let's look at science through the lens. Let's look at life through the lens of science, as opposed to looking at life through the lens of mysticism, which has been the dominant belief system for millennia. That humans are ignorant. We're evolving social primates who wandered around the planet and have taken over. And we hit a bunch of landmarks. We would call them nodes in evolution, where the phylogeny branched. But in reality, what happened is evolutionary traits came around. And I realized if you look at the big picture, you can actually extract a code of ethics from life itself. And then once you have that code of ethics, then you can say, then you can have a church, you can have a belief system. Because that's what a belief system should do. It should direct our behavior to the point where we can say, oh, this is a good thing. That's the big problem with humanism. People have said, oh, you need an absolute deity. How can you be good without a God? And good is relative to whatever you say. If there's not this word of God from the church, who has their priesthood who can manipulate and diddle little boys when they want to, nobody's in charge. And we've learned to question authority, and that needs to be one of the commandments of the evolving Church of Science. And that's where we are. So let's go ahead and walk through there. Because what would the commandments be in the evolving Church of Science? What would we write down in the Bioble if we could actually do this? Well, we'd have to start with the essence of life itself. That, as far as we can tell, life appeared on this earth about 3.5 billion years ago. As biology tells us through the cell theory that everything's made of one cell. And about 4 billion years ago, there were no cells. And about 3 billion years ago, there were lots of cells. And somewhere in between, cellular life figured it out. Molecular autocatalytic replicators, however you want to look at that, biochemistry that in the primordial soup of the primitive earth, back at the age of the Archean, that would have been the big distinction. I love the terminology that we use for the major geological eras. And then we could talk about the Hadean going to the Archean. The Archeans are the oldest cells that we know of. And archaea still live with us in very bizarre places. Sometimes they're called the extremophiles. They live in volcanic vents and acidic tidal pools and all these weird places on Earth that apparently resemble Earth before life came about reshaping the planet. When it was in the Hadean era, when it was like Hades, volcanic fire and sulfur and brimstone, whatever brimstone is, and those things with the Earth cooling in the early solar system. And then somewhere in those early tidal pools, as water washed in and out and allowed for hydrolysis and dehydration synthesis reactions, and different chemicals bonded together, and some catalyzed reactions, and enough of them came together to form a primitive metabolism that got encapsulated in a cell membrane, and it was able to copy itself. It was able to absorb enough nutrients and make a duplicate of itself. And there was nothing there to eat it because nothing else was alive yet. And those first cells came about, and that's the essence of the first commandment in the evolving church of science. Do good means preserve life whenever you can. It beats death. I have a running discussion with my daughter about some of the science fiction we watch and fantasy. Doctor Strange would have been a recent example, the first Doctor Strange movie in the Marvel verse, where people praise a death god. Dormammu in the Marvel verse. How would anybody why would anybody praise a death god? You have to ask the question. It's because being alive has got to be better than being dead because we don't know. Nobody knows what's going to go on afterwards. We've created all of the wonderful mystical religions to try to give us this idea of life after death because people are afraid of death and they don't want to face that. But here in the evolving church of science, we say, we don't know. You don't know either. And we don't know what's going to happen after we're all dead. So the best thing we can do is celebrate life and preserve life whenever we can. Doesn't mean you can't kill something. We have to kill something to eat. We are heterotrophs. We have to eat other organisms to get our organic molecules. Yeah, maybe we'll be able to synthesize them from scratch one day. But for right now, even if you're an lacto pescatarian, you've got to eat something. And so the first commandment in the church is do good and keep life alive. Preserve life whenever you can. And then figure out how to get along with people, because the next major biological leap in the history of life on Earth comes about 1 billion years later in what we call the Proterozoic era. And the protists are the eukaryotes. You've learned that one in high school. The prokaryotic bacterial cells without nuclei versus the eukaryotic cell with nuclei. Because eukaryotes evolved, especially importantly because of a process called endosymbiosis, where they picked up mitochondria. And mitochondria used to be free-living bacteria, but some early cells encapsulated them, pulled them inside their membrane, or however the transition worked. We haven't quite got all the mechanics worked out, whatever miraculous event that was. But it was a symbiotic relationship. It was a give and take. It was an agreement to get along. So, for that 1 billion years of life during the Archean, any cellular organism had to fight any other cellular organism for resources. It was all about competition at staying alive. And everybody, the best you could do is stay alive. And you took out the competition if you had to. But then we realized there's another side of the coin to evolutionary selection. You can compete or you can cooperate. And if you cooperate, you can form a bigger network. And that gave us the first multicellular organisms, the first multi-compartmented organisms, the idea of eukaryotic cells with different membrane compartments. And then in that same era, before we get to the modern, the more recent 500 million year ago, Paleozoic era, when we first get some bony animals, you had multicellular animals. You had sponges and worms and all sorts of fun things back leading up through the Ediacaran. And the eras that led to multicellularity were just an extension of the age of the eukaryotes, of cooperating instead of competing all the time. There's still competition, of course. Natural selection still driving this process, as it's done for 3.5 billion years here on Earth. But we went from always competing to sometimes cooperating while we're still competing. And that's the second commandment in the church. Get along with each other. Figure out who your group is. Excuse me. And then, this is a big one for the church. And then we hit into the Paleozoic. And who came about in the Paleozoic? We already done the deuterostomes. We were able to tell our horse from a hole in the ground, and had decided whether we should build bodies from head to tail or tail to head. And then somebody switched the skeleton system. So we'd already switched head to tail to head. We had protostomes and deuterostomes working their way through the biological order. And somewhere along the way, the first chordates evolved. We have our modern representatives of things like branchiostoma or amphioxus, depending on how old you want to dig back in the literature. But the first chordates went from having exoskeletons to endoskeletons. The chordates evolved the first true endoskeletons, and that's eventually going to become the vertebral column. The spine, have a backbone. Have some frickin' backbone and stand up for something. That's the third commandment in the Church of Science. Figure out what your life is. Figure out what the boundaries are in life. Figure out who's on your side, who's against you, and then stand up for something. Have a spine, because that's what we did in the Paleozoic. Our ancestors stood up. They didn't really stand up, but they figured out the endoskeleton. We're not going to get bipeds for hundreds of millions of years, but having a backbone and then adding bone and cartilage tissue, reinforcing it, allows you to build a bigger body. Because that's really what standing up for something is, realizing you have some strength, you have some capital to play with, you have political capital in the social realm. In the biological realm, you have size and strength and speed and wits and guile. And can you compete and cooperate and form better groups and stay alive? We're still dealing with natural selection here. You still got to stay alive. You still got to get along with everybody else. You still got to compete for resources. But by getting bigger, bigger is better, as long as you're on the side of big. We're going to run into too big later on. But for right now, in the Paleozoic, 500 million years ago, we're dealing with the idea that there are vertebrate animals. And vertebrate animals then took over the planet. Because that's after the Paleozoic, we get the Mesozoic. And during the Paleozoic, we started out with the first vertebrates were all fishes. They were swimming around, but somewhere in the Paleozoic, we got Tiktaalik and Ichthyostega and all these critters that crawled out of the ocean, crawled out of the ponds and lakes and rivers, and some of them got up on land. And they figured out how to add muscles to their fins, and they adapted endoskeletons with fleshy limbs, the sarcopterygons, and the sarco flesh, and they got meat and muscle, and they were able to generate movable limbs. And when they had movable limbs, they could get up in the shallows, and they could eventually get on land. You had to do another big adaptation. You had to take some of the lungfish. You had to use lungs to shift from gills. But oxygen is such a big payoff. If I can get out of the water and breathe air, I get so much more oxygen. I get so much more energy out of my metabolism that moving up on land and being able to fuel my big body with my bones to support me and move around on land gave us the amphibians. And then they got defensive adaptations, and we got the reptiles. And then during that Mesozoic era, starting about 250 million years ago, the reptiles totally took over. We had the age of the dinosaurs. We had Jurassic Park. That's who's in charge there. And what's the lesson to be learned from there? Because we've already stood up. We wanted to stand up for something. We stood up for ourselves back in the Paleozoic. But in the Mesozoic, what we're doing is taking over. We're taking care of that. We're actually celebrating diversity. That's another commandment in the Church of Science. In the evolving Church of Science, we say, wait a minute, life has got lots of components. And during the Mesozoic, when the reptiles were in charge, we want to say celebrate diversity because you know who else came about in the Mesozoic were the first mammals. The first mammals show up in the fossil record with the secondary palate. It lets us nurse and breathe at the same time, separates our nasal from our oral cavity. That shows up in the skulls of our ancient ancestors branching off of the reptiles. And during that process, what we get then is mammals coming about. And mammals, a different lifestyle as opposed to, well, the earliest ones copied their reptile ancestors and laid eggs. But soon enough, we started to develop the care that involves taking care of home. Because when an opportunity presents itself, you got to seize it. And that's what happened 66 million years ago. 66 million years ago, a freaking meteor hit the Earth. A meteor that's estimated to have been at least 6 miles in diameter and moving at approximately 12 miles per second. Think about 12 miles per second. That means if you spotted it in a telescope in under a minute, if it was aimed at you, it'd be right on top of you. That's, the farthest telescope you can look down at the moon, and that meteor's coming in, you are toast inside of just not very much time at all. And that meteorite hit Earth. It hit in what's now the Gulf of Mexico, and it left a freaking crater whose remnants are 180 kilometers across. That's what that little curve on the Yucatan Peninsula is. It's remnants of a 266 million year old crater. And what that did was totally disrupted the ecosystem of Earth, totally messed up the biosphere. It's estimated that photosynthesis shut down for a whole year. And lots of plants died, and lots of animals died. And as far as the nice warm-blooded mammals were concerned, the big animals died. The dinos took a hit, and that opened up a whole bunch of evolutionary opportunities, what we like to think of as evolutionary niches, and that leads us to the Cenozoic. And that's where we learn how to take care of home. We gotta be careful because stuff happens like meteorites. And the lesson from the Cenozoic, while we're celebrating the diversity of mammalian life branching off of our reptilian ancestors, we come up into the mammalian era of the Cenozoic era on Earth, the most recent 66 million years of biological evolution when mammals took over, and a few leftover dinos. They became the birds, the archosaurs. But the mammals became the biggest critters. The big dinos that were wiped out by that meteorite, and now we got elephants and blue whales, and these huge mammals used the opportunity to evolve into larger beings. And we got tens of thousands of mammal species on the planet. And some of them figured out how to manipulate things better. They evolved some digits, and they came up with an opposable thumb. And the pandas did it with a wrist bone. They have the panda's thumb is actually a 6th digit. And they watched pandas manipulate bamboo. That's a useful thing. But the primates ancestors branched off within the mammals, within the class of mammals, and we got the order of primates. And the primates gave rise to hundreds of species of monkeys and apes who were able to move around and manipulate things with that opposable thumb. And because we became good tool users, other critters use tools too. Thinking is not, that's the other thing that happened with vertebrates. Way back at the start of the vertebrates, when we shifted our endoskeleton, we ended up growing bigger bodies. Growing bigger bodies means needing more neurons to be able to monitor that body, to sense that body, to move that body, to control those muscles that are attached to those skeletons. And as you grow bigger brains, you start experimenting. Evolution says, hey, make more of something. More is better. Bigger is better. Evolution grows. Life grows. And because if you grow enough, you get an excess. If you get an excess, you can experiment. Because that's what happens with evolution. Evolution is really just a wonderful experiment. That's why the evolving Church of Science is what we should use as our belief system. Because once we understand evolution as a basic property of living systems, then we go through this process where we can transition from single-celled organisms to multicellular organisms, more complex cells, and we can add support systems like spinal columns. And then we can learn to group together and appreciate the diversity of life and how many different opportunities are out there. And then we can actually directly manipulate life as primates. And you got to take care of home. and you got to start controlling your environment, and that's what our human ancestors did, starting tens of thousands of years ago, maybe hundreds of thousands, probably maybe even a few million, because at some point about 6 million years ago, the last shared ancestor with a living species other than humans that's still alive with us today split from the chimpanzees. That was a genetic mutation that led to that, because when you get down into the chromosomes and you look at the DNA, the chimpanzees and the gorillas, who are also considered some of the great apes along with us, that all have 24 pairs of chromosomes, 48 strands of DNA in their nucleus, except humans only have 46. So some weirdos fused their DNA. They changed the chromosome count. They still had all the genes. They were whatever the combination of chimps and humans ancestors were 6 million years ago. But those guys started to have to reproduce differently, because when you start mixing organisms with 46 or with 47 chromosomes versus 38 chromosomes, sometimes you make sperm and eggs with 23 chromosomes, sometimes you make sperm or eggs with 24 chromosomes. And when those mix together, you get weird combinations. And eventually the ones with 48 stayed together, went on to become chimpanzees and bonobos, and the other ones branched off to become humans. And we take our 23 chromosomes, our 23 chromosome pairs, and we interact with each other, and we evolved a few more mutations. We went for the bigger brains. We'd been doing bigger brains all along with vertebrates and doing cephalization, expanding our cranium and making these bigger brains work. But then what happened with the hominids is we started to do real tool use. We mastered fire several million years ago. We became tool users. We were Homo habilis for a while, handyman. And after that we were Homo erectus, and we started to stand up all the time. And we started to migrate. And that's where you get Homo erectus all over the planet. Where humans moved out, we became Homo floresiensis down in the islands of Indonesia. And we moved around, and eventually we got all over the planet. About 20, probably over 11, 12,000 years ago, we had our big break, another big break, appreciating opportunity. And then we had to work for it, because now, starting about 11,000 years ago, 12,000 years ago, we've hit what we call the Holocene, and that was the last big ice age ended. The last significant ice age, where you had glaciers over huge parts of the planet. And things really started to thaw out. We've been in a nice warm period for over 11,000 years now. And what it allowed us to do, and what we figured out, our ancestors figured out, was that we could actually not only control things, we could work it out. We could work the farm. We could start domesticating animals. We'd already domesticated wolves. We took some wolf pups 20,000 years ago, and we'd made dogs. And then we had our man's best friend with us as we hunted and gathered around the planet. And humans were this meandering species living in the ice age. And then it got warmer, and we started planting stuff, and then we started building cities. We made Göbekli Tepe in Turkey. We eventually made Stonehenge and Newgrange in Ireland. Some of us had gotten over to North America and into South America. We started building all of those civilizations for the Incas and the Aztecs. But that was all about work, because that's a commandment in the evolving Church of Science as well. You got to work, because once you start making land, once you start making that excess, now we can really specialize. Just like going from archaean to eukaryotes, and going to having one cellular membrane to having multiple cellular membranes allows you to specialize, gives you more compartments. You can do different chemistry. And then if you do multicellular organisms, you can have whole cells get specialized into tissues and organs. Now you can make multicellular bodies. And you put some of those into a endoskeleton. Now you have an internal framework that you can build on, as opposed to being encased in a shell. That's why there's a real physical reason why there are no monster ants or insects, because endoskeletons versus exoskeletons create a physical dilemma. Endoskeletons allow you to add muscle on top of bone and build an amazingly big body, like T-Rex and blue whales. Exoskeletons like crabs and shrimp are limited, because you got to stick your muscle inside of the shell. and that's going to limit how big you can get. But that's always been the story of evolution, pushing the boundary, working, and that's what we did over 11,000 years ago. We really pushed the domestication issue. And then about 5,000 years ago, we started to think about it, because that's when we really built civilizations. We had our agriculture. We were living high on the hog for 5,000 years. We figured out beer and wine. We were having a good time. We had all these events. We'd go hunter-gatherer. We'd come back to the farms. We'd harvest our crops. We had festivals. We built temples. And we created gods, and we created civilizations. We created empires. That's what ancient history tells us. As we started making money. We figured out metallurgy. We started to do tech. But we had to have empires, and that's where we were for 5,000 years. We had empires compete until we built up. Until about 500 years ago. And that's when we took the big leap. Some white guys and gals from Western Europe figured out this thing we call science. And science is just it's thinking, but it's thinking in a specific way. And what it allowed us to do to enter the last 500 years of what we call the colonial era, or what I call the colonial era. Some other people call it that. But the colonial era is this last 500 years where we had this perfect storm of monotheistic Christianity embedded in with growing capitalism, along with the scientific revolution, and we had the right mix of empire to take over the planet. Because that's what really happened 500 years ago. Western Europe went out and dominated most of the planet. And it became this family order with monarchies until Vicky died, Queen Victoria died. And in the 20th century, we'd built up enough information. We had science, and we were expanding education. We realized we had to think and work more. And we had the scientific revolution and the industrial revolution. And people said, screw these monarchs, screw these empires. We want democracy. We should all have a hand in the government. And America led the way with that. And it led us through the 20th century where we got rid of the kings and the dictators. We threw out fucking Hitler and Mussolini and those guys. We dealt with the Stalins and the Soviet Union. And everybody said, you're right, we don't want centralized economies. We want free markets. But somebody's got to own stuff. And that's where we've gotten to right now. We were in the atomic age. In 1945, we realized straight out brutal force militarism doesn't work, because some people have fucking nuclear weapons. We have so much technology, you can kill so many people in such a short amount of time that we could wipe ourselves out. We had the policy of MAD during the Cold War, mutually assured destruction, that allowed us to say, what can we do with the planet? And now here in the atomic age, we have learned to question authority. That's another commandment in the evolving Church of Science, because we realize nobody's got it right. Nobody has all the answers. That's why we got to throw out the old monotheisms. Keep the good stuff. Keep the rules about not killing each other, not stealing stuff. But people steal stuff all the time. That's the problem, because capitalism is the big force against democracy right now. As much as we might want our belief system to be science and say, oh, we're going to logically think about problems, we're going to set up experiments, and we're going to try things. We try to do that. But at the same time, we're doing it within a capitalist system, which allows for excessive ownership. And that power that can be concentrated in just a few human hands allows a small set of people to still dominate what we do. We know there's a climate change issue. Why don't we change it? Because a small handful of people make billions of dollars by controlling the fossil fuel industry. Now, we know there's poverty and hunger on the world, but other handfuls of people regulate that to say, we don't want to share the wealth. We don't want to do equal pay for equal work. We want to find the cheapest market and go to the place with the most disadvantaged people who we can pay peanuts to, and we're going to do our best supply and demand analysis and push the economic issue, and we're going to grind as much profit out of it as we can. And if somebody suffers, fuck them. And that's where we are right now. We've been questioning authority, we've been working and thinking, been evolving, trying to understand where the boundaries are. And now we have to figure out how to move to the next stage of humanity. the next age when we can be members of the evolving Church of Science, and we stop and we think and we say, wait a minute, how could we do a real democracy? How could we actually limit ownership so that we don't have kings and princes and princesses anymore? And everybody has a home and everybody has a safe opportunity to develop. And we optimize the development of humans. So, because the best thing we can do is think and work. And the best way people are going to do that if they have their own self interest in hand. But they can only have self interest up to the point where we run into each other. And there's only so much room on the planet. And we could either go about killing each other and deciding who's going to survive that way, or we could figure out how to frickin' share like civilized humans and figure out how to build a global civilization where people get enough to eat and have a home, and we get to do things like experiment and create and build things and make art and look for truth and beauty in the universe. And that's where I think we should be going. And that's what the Bioble tells us. Amen.